Hello, I'm Laura Penn, and welcome to Green Views, a talk show about green issues and green solutions, in partnership with Dukascopy TV. Wildlife trafficking is a multi-billion-dollar illicit business, which is decimating many of the world's vulnerable animal and plant populations. Some species run the risk of complete decline or even extinction. Here to talk to us about the environmental and economic costs related to wildlife trafficking is Alessandro Badalotti. He is the coordinator for SOS, which stands for Save Our Species, which is an initiative run by the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, or IUCN. Alessandro Badalotti, welcome to Green Views.
Hello, Laura.
I'd like to start by having you tell us more about what SOS is.
Sure. SOS, Save Our Species, is an initiative of IUCN and partners that was set up about 5 years ago, and it's a conservation fund that disburses funds for projects that are targeting the conservation of threatened species globally.
And what is the relationship between SOS and wildlife trafficking?
Wildlife trafficking affects a wide variety of species these days, all over the world. SOS invests in 87 projects to date that are targeting more than 200 species globally, many of which are also the subject of illegal wildlife trade. So we are supporting a different number of species thanks to the main activities that are needed to counteract wildlife trade.
And what are these activities?
There are three main activities to counteract wildlife trade. One, and the most obvious one, is to support increased levels of law enforcement at the sites, and also to increase the judiciary follow-up for any poaching incidents at the sites and in the countries where these species live. The second, and also very important way of countering this trade, is to reduce the demand for the species or the body parts in the end markets, and therefore cutting and reducing consumption of these species. The third, and also very important element, is to support those communities that live close to the species in the wild by supporting them to find alternative livelihoods or local economic development that supports the existence of the species at the site level, so they don't feel they have to participate in the illegal wildlife trade.
Okay, that's very well said. And what are the costs of wildlife trafficking, both in financial terms and to the planet?
Well, in financial terms, it's quite difficult to quantify wildlife trafficking because of its clandestine nature. But it has been estimated to involve something, a figure in the range of 6 to 20 billion US dollars annually.
That's quite a big gap in between.
It is. It's an estimate that is determined from the seizures that happen at borders or at custom control, so there is a degree of uncertainty related to it. However, it is very clear that wildlife trafficking is the fourth most lucrative type of trafficking globally, after the trafficking of humans, of weapons, and of drugs.
Very interesting. Okay, that's high up on the list, in other words.
Definitely high up on the list. In terms of financial consequences of the wildlife trade, the local communities and the countries from which these species are taken, are actually stolen from, do suffer the consequences from the loss of revenue that could be gained through taxing sustainable practices, sustainable use of these species, but also ecotourism and ecotourism ventures locally. To the environment, the disappearance of some of these species can also be very dangerous, because many of these species have a specific role in their ecosystems, and if you remove, say, a top predator, such as a tiger or a wolf, just to understand each other, you will also generate some consequences for that system. Their prey, usually herbivores, will then increase and will in turn affect the vegetation at the site, therefore causing consequences.
Okay, I can see that illustration in front of me. Now, I'd like to know some examples of some of the species that are used in wildlife trafficking.
Many of them are well known and actually, luckily, make it to the news these days. And we are talking about the tigers and the elephants and the rhinos of the world that are heavily traded and have been for a long time. But many other species are more unknown to the general public and don't really make it into the news.
Like who?
These might include species such as fish and birds and plants that are traded for the ornamental sector, but increasingly also weird species that people have not heard about.
Like what, Alessandro?
One of them is the pangolin. It's one of my favorite examples.
Pangolin. What's a pangolin?
The pangolin is the most heavily traded mammal globally these days. They are scaly anteaters. They are a mammal covered in scales. There are 8 different species that are found in Africa and Asia, and their scales and their meat is traded and sold especially in Southeast Asia and on the Chinese and Vietnamese market. The scales are believed to carry all sorts of medicinal properties and to cure all sorts of ailments, which is unproven. However, they're still sold for a very high price. The meat of pangolins is considered a delicacy in those countries, and it's eaten by the new affluent cadres that enjoy that as a specialty dish.
Okay, and what are some other species that are lesser known that are traded in wildlife trafficking?
I'd like to give you an example for the marine realm. Sharks are overfished for their fins, and people have heard about those, but people don't hear much about manta rays, these gentle giants of the seas that sort of fly underwater. Many tourists flock to 23 countries only globally to see them, to dive and snorkel with them every year. And this generates quite a lot of income for those countries. However, manta rays are overfished for their gill plates, part of their respiratory organs, which are then bottled under spirit and sold in certain markets, again in Southeast Asia and China, as a tonic. Unknown to the people purchasing these, they're actually poisonous because they contain heavy metals such as lead, mercury, and cadmium. Therefore, keeping these species out there in the oceans, it's much better than killing them for this market.
Yeah, it really seems like what you're saying is that it makes economic sense to keep the animals where they are instead of letting them disappear.
Absolutely. In the case of the manta rays, they generate about $73 million per year just in terms of dive and snorkel operations.
That's a lot of money.
And $140 million on top of that if you consider the whole impact in the tourism sector in those 23 countries. So these numbers can be seen as quite important. If you consider the impact of the funding that SOS has provided to date, $9 million, that is unfortunately just a drop in the ocean compared to the money that is needed to preserve threatened species.
How much, ballpark figure, money is needed to protect species, so to speak?
It's interesting because it has been calculated recently, and the study showed that about $80 billion are needed annually.
Annually?
Annually, to conserve all threatened species and the habitats they depend on.
That seems like a great deal of money.
It does seem like a great deal of money, but to put it in perspective, it's actually about 20% of the annual global income generated by soft drinks.
Alessandro, what is the future outlook for wildlife trafficking and for SOS?
Well, wildlife trafficking is there to stay, unfortunately, and luckily many different initiatives are cropping up to counteract it and provide funding against these sort of illicit activities. SOS, on its side, will certainly continue to do more and more against wildlife trafficking in the different ways that I described earlier. So we will be funding certainly projects that are targeting the species that are traded illegally and the habitats from which they are coming. So stay tuned for more stories in the future.
Alessandro, thank you for your valuable insights today, and good luck with all the work that you're doing.
Thank you, Laura.
And thank you for watching. This is Laura Penn with Green Views, a talk show about green issues and green solutions in partnership with Dukascopy TV. Until next time.